Alara stood on the porch of the house that was no longer hers and felt nothing. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the familiar pines her grandfather had planted decades ago. She was 22 years old, and the world had been hollowed out from the inside. Her uncle, her mother's brother, stood in the doorway, his face a mask of strained politeness. He did not look her in the eye. He looked at a point just over her shoulder, at the tree line where the property ended and the state forest began. The papers were signed. The sale was final. Her life, contained within the cedar-shingled walls behind him, had been sold for a sum she would never know. "It's for the best, Alara," he said, his voice as thin as old paper. "A young woman like you, alone in a place this size. It's not practical." He spoke of practicality as if it were a holy virtue, the only one that mattered. He did not speak of the summers she had spent here, learning the names of the trees. He did not speak of the winter she had nursed her grandfather through his final illness in the downstairs bedroom. He did not speak of love, or memory, or home. He spoke of ledgers and liabilities. She did not cry. She did not plead. She had learned from her grandfather that some forces, like weather or the turning of seasons, could not be argued with. Human greed, she was discovering, was one of them. Her grandfather had been a surveyor, and before that, a stonemason. He was a man who believed in the tangible, in the things you could measure with a rule and test with a level. He had taught her not with lectures, but with labor. He taught her how to read the grain of wood, to know which tree would split true, and which would fight the axe. He taught her how to mix mortar, the precise ratio of sand and lime and water. A recipe, he said, was as important as any in a kitchen. He taught her how to use an adze to shape a beam, the rhythmic thud and curl of the wood chips a language in itself. He taught her that competence was a fortress, a shelter you built for yourself that no one could ever take away. When he died, he had left her little in the way of coin, for he had never been a man to hoard it. He left her his tools, their wooden handles worn smooth and dark with the oil of his hands. He left her the knowledge of how to use them, and he left her one other thing, a small object she kept in a leather pouch on her belt. It was a plumb bob, turned from a solid piece of brass, heavy and dense in her palm. It was a tool for finding the true vertical, for establishing a line straight and honest from a single point. "Gravity never lies, Ellie," he used to say, holding it up, its point aimed at the heart of the world. "Find your center, and you can build anything." Her uncle held out an envelope. It was thin. "This should help you get started somewhere else," he said, the words a dismissal. She took it without a word, feeling the faint outlines of a few folded bills through the paper. She knew without looking it would be an insulting sum, a gesture meant to salve his conscience, not to secure her future. It was the final transaction in a long, cold administrative banishment. She turned from the porch, her gaze sweeping one last time over the workshop, where the scent of sawdust and her grandfather's pipe tobacco still lingered. She did not look back at the man in the doorway. She walked down the gravel path, her boots crunching a steady, deliberate rhythm. With each step, she felt the house, the memories, the entire geography of her life recede behind her. She walked until the familiar shape of the roof was lost behind the hills. In a small clearing, she stopped and opened the envelope. Inside were two $20 bills and a 10. $50, the price of a childhood, the final closing of the books on her grandfather's legacy. A bitter laugh, dry and soundless, caught in her throat. She folded the bills carefully and tucked them into her pocket. She had a single canvas satchel on her back. It held a change of clothes, a whetstone, a small handsaw, her grandfather's worn leather gloves, and the brass plumb bob in its pouch. Everything else, the heavy hammers, the saws, the levels, she had been forced to leave behind. They were too much to carry. But the knowledge of them, she carried that inside her. It was weightless and indestructible. She did not know where she was going, only that she was heading west. away from the soft, green hills of her youth, and toward the stark, unforgiving country she had only ever seen on maps. For 3 days she walked, buying bread and cheese in small towns, sleeping in haylofts or under the cover of rocky overhangs. The land grew drier, the trees smaller and more gnarled. The sky grew larger, a vast, empty bowl of blue that offered no comfort. She was an island in a sea of sagebrush and dust, her own solitude a tangible presence beside her. The grief she had held at bay since her grandfather's death, and then since her uncle's cold pronouncement, began to thaw. It did not come as a storm of tears, but as a slow, aching seep, a cold dampness behind her eyes. She kept walking. The methodical act of putting one foot in front of the other was the only thing that made sense. On the 4th day, she arrived in a town called Terminus. It was aptly named. It felt like the end of the line, a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled against the vast, empty expanse of the Badlands. Dust coated everything in a fine, gritty film. The air was thin and smelled of alkali and distance. In the town's only saloon, which also served as a general store, she sat nursing a glass of water, listening to the low murmur of conversation around her. 2 old men in dusty coats were talking at the bar, their voices raspy. "County's finally putting the old Silas dugout up for tax sale," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. The other man laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Who in their right mind would buy that pile of dirt? Cursed, they say. Silas died in there, crazy as a loon. Place has been collapsing in on itself for 50 years. "Asking $2, the first man said, and they both chuckled. $2 for a grave. Alara listened, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. A dugout, a home carved from the earth itself. The idea resonated with something deep inside her, a sense of stone and permanence. It was the kind of dwelling her grandfather would have respected for its sheer, stubborn utility. Cursed, collapsing, $2. The words echoed in her mind. It was a fool's purchase. It was a grave. But it was also a place. And a place, however ruined, was more than she had. A flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope sparked in the hollow space in her chest. The next morning, she walked into the county clerk's office, a small, stuffy room at the back of the sheriff's building. The clerk was a portly man with a sweat-stained collar and an air of profound boredom. He looked up from his newspaper, his eyes barely registering her presence. "Help you?" he grunted. "I'm here about the property for tax sale," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The Silas dugout." The clerk blinked, then a slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, condescending amusement. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "You're kiddin' me, missy. That place, it ain't nothing but a hole in the ground full of snakes and bad memories. The deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on." "I'll take it," she said, her gaze steady. His smile widened. He clearly thought it was a fine joke. "All right, suit yourself. It's your money." He shuffled through a stack of dusty papers, pulled out a single yellowed sheet, and blew a cloud of dust from its surface. $2, as advertised. Non-refundable. He watched her, a smirk playing on his lips, as she carefully unfolded 2 of the precious bills from her pocket and laid them on the worn counter. He took the money, his movements exaggerated and slow, as if handling something comical. He scribbled a signature, stamped the page with a heavy, thudding finality, and pushed it across the counter to her. "There you go," he said, barely suppressing a laugh. "You are now the proud owner of one prime piece of desolate wasteland. Don't come crying to me when the roof caves in on you." Alara took the deed, folded it, and placed it in her satchel. She did not give him the satisfaction of a reply. She simply nodded and walked out, the sound of his wheezing laughter following her into the dusty street. She had $38, a handful of tools, a worthless deed, and the weight of his mockery. But for the first time in weeks, she had a direction. She had a destination. She had a place to call her own. It took her the rest of the day to find it. The directions the clerk had mockingly given her were vague, but the canyon he'd pointed toward was a deep scar in the earth, unmistakable. The dugout was carved into the base of a sandstone cliff, its entrance almost completely obscured by a landslide of rock and sun-baked earth. What little she could see of the original structure was a crumbling ruin. The heavy timber lintel over the doorway had cracked in the center, and the entire entrance looked ready to collapse. The clerk had been right. It was a hole in the ground. It was a grave. A wave of despair, cold and immense, washed over her. The hope that had carried her this far evaporated under the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. She had traded her last real chance at a new start for this, a pile of rubble. She sank to the ground, the dust puffing up around her, and for the first time since her grandfather's passing, a single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She let it fall, a tiny, dark spot in the pale dirt. Then she wiped its successor away with the back of her hand. Crying wouldn't fix the cracked lintel. Weeping wouldn't clear the tons of earth. She got to her feet and took the plumb bob from its pouch. Its familiar weight was a comfort, a connection to a time when problems had seemed solid and solvable. She walked the perimeter of the landslide, her eyes scanning the rock face, the angle of the slope, the types of stone. Her grandfather had taught her to read the earth as well as he read wood. She saw not just a mess, but a puzzle of physics. She saw the point of failure, the lines of stress. She saw that while the entrance was a disaster, the main body of the dugout, deeper in the cliff, was likely protected by the sheer mass of the stone above it. She found a small, secondary opening to one side, probably an old ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. It was choked with debris, but less so than the main entrance. With her hands and the small blade of her saw, she began to dig. It was slow, back-breaking work. The sun beat down and sweat stung her eyes. But with every handful of dirt she cleared, with every rock she pried loose, the despair receded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic focus of labor. By the time dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the canyon rim, she'd cleared a passage. The air that flowed out was cool and smelled of dry dust, of stone, of long abandoned spaces. She crawled inside. It was nearly pitch black, but her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. It was a single, large chamber, bigger than she had expected. Most of it was filled with the dirt and rock that had spilled from the collapsed entrance, but the rear half of the room was clear. The walls were rough-hewn sandstone, the tool marks of its creator still visible after half a century. It was small, but it was solid. It was a fortress. She had found her shelter. For the next week, her life fell into a simple, brutal rhythm. Dawn brought the work of clearing the main chamber, a seemingly endless task. She had no shovel, so she used a flat piece of shale and her bare hands to haul the dirt and rubble outside, bucketful by bucketful, using her canvas satchel. In the afternoons, she would forage for edible plants and scout the canyon for water, finding a small, reliable seep a half-mile away. At night, she slept on the bare stone floor in the cleared portion of the dugout, wrapped in her thin blanket, the profound silence of the canyon her only companion. She grew leaner, her hands calloused and raw, but her spirit, which had felt so brittle, began to harden. She was not just surviving, she was working, and in the work there was a kind of salvation. It was during the second week of clearing the back wall that she found it. She was running her hand along the sandstone, feeling its texture, a habit her grandfather had instilled in her. He said you could learn more about stone with your fingers than your eyes. Near the floor in the far right corner, one particular block of stone felt different. It was smoother than the surrounding rock, and when she tapped it with the handle of her saw, the sound was not the dull thud of solid stone, but a faint, hollow resonance. It was almost imperceptible. Anyone else would have missed it, but she had spent years listening to the sound stone makes. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She knelt, examining the block more closely. The seams around it were finer, filled with a mortar that was a slightly different color and texture from the rest. It was masterful work, designed to be overlooked. Using the tip of her saw blade as a probe, she began to carefully scrape at the seam. It was slow, tedious work, the sandstone crumbling into fine powder under her patient efforts. She worked until her fingers were numb and her shoulders ached, driven by a certainty she couldn't explain. Finally, after hours of chipping away at the mortar, she was able to work the blade into the seam and use it as a tiny lever. With a low grinding sound, the stone shifted. It wasn't a block, but a carefully fitted plug. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. It was heavy, but it moved, sliding out from the wall to reveal a dark, rectangular cavity behind it. The air that wafted out was still and dry, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old canvas and rust. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against rough fabric. She pulled out a small, heavy canvas bag, tied at the neck with a leather thong. It clinked with a dense, muffled sound. She set it aside and reached back in. There was another, and another, and another. 6 bags in total. Beside them was a rectangular tin box, its surface filmed with a light layer of rust. She pulled it out and set it on the floor beside the bags. For a long moment, she just stared at her discovery, her breath held tight in her chest. With shaking fingers, she untied the thong on the first bag and tipped its contents onto her blanket. Gold coins spilled out, gleaming with a soft, buttery light in the dimness of the dugout. They were heavy, real, their milled edges cool against her skin. She opened the other 5 bags. They were all the same, filled to the brim with gold coins of varying sizes. It was a fortune. It was an impossible, life-altering fortune, hidden in a dusty hole in the ground she had bought for $2. After the initial shock subsided, she turned her attention to the tin box. The lid was tight, but she managed to pry it open with the edge of her saw. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a single leather-bound logbook. The leather was dry and cracked, but the book was intact. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was a neat, precise script, written in faded black ink. "My name is Silas Kane," the first entry read. "And if you are reading this, it means you have found my home, and I am long gone. It also means you are patient, and you pay attention to the stone. For that, you have my respect." Alara read on, completely absorbed. The logbook told the story of a man not unlike her grandfather. Silas had been a mining engineer from the East, a man who believed in geology, in pressure, and in the honest work of extracting value from the earth. He had come west with a partner, a man he'd trusted like a brother. Together, they had discovered a rich vein of gold, not far from this very canyon. But on the day they were to file the claim, his partner had vanished, along with the geological maps and all their shared capital. He had filed the claim in his own name, leaving Silas with nothing but a warrant for his arrest on trumped-up charges of fraud. Betrayed and hunted, Silas had retreated into the Badlands, a landscape as broken and desolate as his own heart. He had carved this dugout with his own hands, a fortress against a world he no longer trusted, and then, through sheer luck and his own deep knowledge of the rock, he had stumbled upon a second vein, a small but incredibly rich deposit of placer gold in the creek bed at the bottom of the canyon. It was the fortune she had just found. He had spent years gathering it, but he had never spent a single coin. The world of men, of commerce and contracts, had betrayed him. He could not bring himself to participate in it again. This gold was a comfort, and then it was a burden, he wrote in one of the last entries. "It is a treasure I cannot use, and a secret I cannot share. I have no kin, no heir. The man who cheated me lived a rich life and died in a warm bed, his children inheriting his stolen prosperity. There is no justice in that. But perhaps there can be a different kind of justice, a justice of chance, and skill. The final entry was written in a shakier hand, the ink paler. I am old now, and the dust is settling in my lungs. This dugout has been my sanctuary and my prison. I leave it, and all that is hidden within it, to the one who finds it. Not by chance, but by character. If you have the patience to clear the rubble, the eye to see the seam in the stone, and the skill to open it without destroying it, then you are the heir I never had. Do not make my mistake. Do not let this gold become an anchor. Use it. Build something. Build a life. Find a peace I could never quite grasp. The world can be a cruel place, but it is also the only one we have. Make your place in it. This is my last will and testament." Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, aching gratitude, of a kinship that reached across 50 years of silence. She was not alone. This solitary, betrayed man had seen her, had known her, without ever laying eyes on her. He had passed on not just a fortune, but a blessing. He had given her a purpose. She carefully placed the logbook back in its tin box, a sacred text. The gold was a tool, but the book was the blueprint. That night, she slept with the heavy tin box beside her, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly, deeply wealthy. The discovery changed everything. The work was no longer a matter of mere survival. It was an act of creation, of honoring Silas's legacy. With the means to buy proper tools and materials, her progress accelerated. Her first trip back to Terminus was a quiet triumph. She walked into the general store run by a woman named Lena, a practical, no-nonsense matriarch who watched the town's comings and goings with a sharp eye. Alara bought a sturdy shovel, a pickaxe, a heavy sledgehammer, and a coil of good rope. She paid for it all with a single, small gold coin. Lena looked at the coin, then at Alara's calloused hands and the dust ingrained in her clothes. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, simply weighing the coin on a small brass scale and giving Alara her change in dollars. A silent transaction of respect had taken place. Lena had seen enough prospectors, both lucky and deluded, to know the difference between a fool and someone who worked for what they had. With the new tools, the work on the dugout became a methodical campaign of restoration. She cleared the remaining rubble from the entrance, a task that took 2 more weeks of relentless labor. Then she addressed the cracked lintel. She used the sledgehammer to carefully demolish the compromised beam and the crumbling stonework around it. She needed a new lintel, a massive piece of timber, stronger than the last. There were no trees large enough in the canyon, so she walked the 10 miles back to Terminus. She was directed to the forge at the edge of town, run by a blacksmith named Corwin. He was a mountain of a man with a beard full of soot and arms like tree trunks. He was known for being gruff and dismissive. When she asked him about getting a log hauled, he grunted without looking up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "Don't have time for odd jobs, girl." "I also need some custom tools," Alara said, undeterred. "And I need these hinges made. The design requires a full lap weld on the pintle." She laid a broken pickaxe head on his bench. "And this needs to be reforged and tempered. The steel is good, but it was quenched too fast. It's brittle." Corwin stopped hammering. He slowly turned and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He picked up the pickaxe head, his thumb rubbing the fractured metal. He looked at the simple, clear sketch she had drawn for the hinges. He looked at her steady, knowing eyes. "Where'd you learn about tempering steel?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "My grandfather," she said. "He believed in knowing how things are made." A slow nod from the big man. "Aye, a good belief." He put her pickaxe head into the forge, the coals glowing white-hot as he worked the bellows. "I'll see about that log for you." Corwin helped her select a seasoned ironwood log from a woodcutter's yard and arranged for it to be hauled by wagon to the mouth of her canyon. From there, using her new rope, a system of levers and sheer, stubborn effort. Alara spent 3 days wrestling the massive beam up the slope and into place. She dressed it with an adze, the wood chips flying, until it was perfectly shaped. Then, using the skills her grandfather had taught her, she began to rebuild the entrance, laying a new foundation and setting stones with fresh, strong mortar. She used her brass plumb bob constantly, ensuring every stone was true, every line perfect. The entrance she built was not just a repair, it was a statement. It was stronger and more beautiful than the original, a seamless marriage of stone and wood. Her work did not go unnoticed. An old trapper named Jedediah, who lived a solitary life in the canyons, began to stop by. He was a wiry man with skin like tanned leather, and he moved through the landscape with a silent grace. At first, he would just watch from a distance, a silent observer. Then, one day, he approached, holding out a brace of rabbits. "Saw your smoke," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Figured you could use some fresh meat." He looked at the new stonework around her door. "That's good work. You set those stones to shed water, not just to stack 'em." It was the highest compliment he could give. Alara accepted the rabbits with a grateful nod. "Thank you." From then on, Jed became a regular visitor. He never offered charity, but he would trade his knowledge of the canyon, where to find the best clay for chinking, which plants were remedies for cuts and fevers, how to read the clouds for an impending storm, for a cup of coffee or a shared meal. He spoke of Silas, whom he remembered from his own boyhood as a silent, haunted man. "He'd have liked what you're doing here," Jed said one evening, looking at the warm light spilling from Alara's new window, giving the place a soul again. Through Corwin, Jed, and Lena, Alara slowly became a part of the landscape's spare community. They were people who, like her, valued competence over conversation and respected self-reliance above all. They saw the dugout transform from a ruin into a home. She carved shelves into the stone walls, built a sturdy door from planks Corwin helped her source, and installed a small, efficient stove that Lena ordered for her. The interior, once a dark cave, became a warm, functional space, lit by oil lamps and the glow from the fire. One afternoon, as she was splitting firewood, she saw a figure on horseback approaching. It was the county clerk, the man who had laughed at her. He was dressed in hunting gear and had a rifle slung over his saddle. He reined in his horse, his mouth falling slightly open as he stared at the dugout. He took in the solid stone entrance, the neat wooden door, the curl of smoke from the chimney pipe, the small thriving garden she had managed to cultivate near the seep. He looked at her, standing straight and strong, the axe held loosely in her hand. The mockery was gone from his face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, shaking his head. He seemed to be at a loss for words. He had sold her a grave, and she had turned it into a fortress. She just looked at him, her expression calm and unreadable. There was nothing to say. The work spoke for itself. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, his shoulders slumped. Alara felt a quiet, satisfying sense of closure. She had not defeated him. His own shallow judgment had defeated itself. That autumn, the sky turned a bruised, greenish gray. Jed had been watching the clouds for days. "Big one's coming," he'd warned her. "When the water comes down this canyon, it comes like a train." The rain began as a drizzle, then became a downpour, and then a deluge. The dry creek bed at the bottom of the canyon became a raging, brown torrent in a matter of hours. The sound was a deafening roar. Alara stood just inside her doorway, watching the awesome power of the flood. Her dugout was set high enough on the cliff face to be safe, the stonework she had so carefully laid, shedding the sheets of water effortlessly. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement on a rocky outcrop downstream, a piece of high ground that was rapidly becoming an island. It was Jed. He had been caught out checking his trap lines. The water was rising fast, threatening to swallow his small perch. Without a second thought, she grabbed her coil of rope. She tied one end securely to a new iron ring Corwin had forged for her, set deep into the stone beside her door. She looped the other end over her shoulder and began to climb, not down, but up and across the cliff face. It was a treacherous route she had scouted before, a series of handholds and footholds that only someone who had studied the rock would know. The wind and rain lashed at her, but her focus was absolute. She moved with the steady, practiced confidence of a person who understood leverage and balance. She reached a point on the cliff directly above him. "Jed!" she yelled over the roar of the water. He looked up, his face grim. She lowered the rope to him. He was weak with cold, but he managed to tie it securely around his waist. "Hold on!" she shouted. She braced herself, her feet wedged into a fissure, and began to pull, hand over hand. It was a grueling, desperate struggle. The rope cut into her raw hands, and her muscles screamed in protest. But she thought of her grandfather's lessons, of Silas's resilience, and she pulled with everything she had. Slowly, foot by foot, she hauled him up the slippery rock face to the relative safety of the ledge beside her. From there, she helped him stumble back along the cliff to the shelter of her home. Inside, she wrapped him in dry blankets and sat him by the stove, forcing hot, sweet coffee into his hands. He was shaking, his face pale with shock and cold. "You saved my life, girl," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That was a fool thing I did, getting caught out." "We all misjudge the weather sometimes," Alara said simply, adding more wood to the fire. Her home, the worthless ruin, had become a sanctuary. It had saved not only her, but another. The act cemented her place. She was no longer an outsider, but a part of the canyon, a fixture as solid as the stone she had laid. In the quiet of the following winter, Alara found a final task in Silas's logbook. He had mentioned the name of the partner who betrayed him, and the town in the east he had come from. Using a small portion of the gold, she hired a discreet lawyer in a distant city through a letter sent with Lena's help on a freight wagon. She asked him to investigate the man's family. The lawyer's reply came months later. The partner's stolen fortune had been squandered by his son, and his grandchildren were now living in poverty. There was no justice in the world, Silas had written, but perhaps there could be a different kind. Alara sent a larger sum of gold to the lawyer, with instructions to set up an anonymous trust for the education and welfare of those children. It was not forgiveness. It was balance. It was the closing of a circle, a final settling of a debt that was not hers, but which she had inherited. Years passed. The dugout became a place of quiet renown. It was not a house, but a part of the cliff itself, weathered and timeless. The garden flourished. Alara learned the rhythms of the seasons in the Badlands, the subtle shifts in light and wind. She was no longer the hollowed-out girl who had arrived with nothing but $50 and a deep, abiding grief. She was a woman made of the same resilient stuff as the stone she lived in. One clear, cool evening, she sat on the stone bench she had built by her door, carving a piece of cottonwood. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in hues of rose and gold. The air was still, filled with the scent of dust and juniper. She was at peace, a feeling so deep and steady it felt like a part of her own bones. Inside, on a shelf she had carved into the sandstone wall, two objects sat side by side. One was her grandfather's brass plumb bob, its surface polished to a soft gleam, its point aimed, as always, at the center of the earth. The other was a single, beautiful, uncut nugget of gold, the one Silas had described in his journal as the first piece he ever found. It was rough and pure, a captured piece of sunlight. They were her two inheritances. One was the tool that taught her how to build a straight and honest life, the legacy of skill and character passed down from her grandfather. The other was the fruit of a stranger's sorrow and solitude, a legacy of fortune that had given her the means, but not the reason. She had learned that the true fortune was never the gold in the wall. The true inheritance was the strength in her hands, the knowledge in her mind, and the quiet determination in her heart to build a place for herself in the world. The $50 her uncle had given her was long gone. The $2 she had paid the laughing clerk had been the foundation of everything. It was, she reflected as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, the best money she had ever spent.